In the heart of London's glittering music scene, a genius composer, Victor Langston, is found strangled in his studio, a violin string tight around his throat. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming sleuth from St. Mary Mead, unraveling a web of envy, ambition, and betrayal. A conductor's pride, a soprano's passion, a manager's greed, and a rival's jealousy, each holds a secret. With missing pages of a masterpiece, a broken window, and a single green thread, Miss Marple pieces together a symphony of clues to reveal a killer who turned music into murder. Can she strike the final note of truth before the curtain falls? Chapter 1. The silent studio. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cushioned armchair by the bay window of her modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow across the room. Her knitting needles moved with a rhythmic precision, the soft clack-clack a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. On the small mahogany table beside her lay a letter, its envelope bearing the bold, impatient handwriting of her nephew Raymond West. The paper was creased from her careful rereading, for it contained news both intriguing and grim. Victor Langston, a celebrated composer, had been found dead in his London studio that very morning. Strangled with a violin string. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on the letter. Raymond, ever the dramatist, had filled the pages with vivid details. Langston was to have premiered his 7th Symphony, a work whispered to be his finest, at a gala concert in Covent Garden. The event had promised to draw London's elite, from critics to patrons, all eager to hear the composer's latest triumph. But now the music was silenced, and suspicion hung over for figures. Sir Rowland Havers, the conductor, Clara Vane, the soprano, Edwin Price, Langston's manager, and Felix Mortimer, a rival composer whose star had dimmed in Langston's shadow. Each had been at the studio the previous night, attending a rehearsal that, according to Raymond, had crackled with tension. A composer, Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing, is like a weaver, threading notes into patterns. But someone has cut the thread. She set the knitting aside and picked up the letter again, her lips pursed. Raymond's account was vivid but incomplete, as was his way. He wrote of Langston's genius, his tempestuous nature, and the rivalries that swirled around him like moths to a flame. Yet he offered no theories, only a plea for his aunt's insight. "You see things, Aunt Jane," he had written, "that others miss. Come to London. The police are baffled." Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the window. Beyond the lace curtains, her garden bloomed with late dahlias, their colours defiant against the autumn chill. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid behind polite smiles, much like in the glittering world of music Raymond described. A strangled composer, a studio filled with manuscripts, a violin string as a weaponette was a puzzle that called to her. People, she said softly, are the same everywhere, whether in a village or a concert hall. And jealousy, I fear, is a universal tune. She turned to her writing desk, where a small suitcase waited, already half-packed. Her housekeeper, Cherry, had fussed earlier, insisting that London was no place for a lady of Miss Marple's years. But Miss Marple had only smiled, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A violin string suggested intimacy, a weapon close at hand, perhaps seized in a moment of rage. The suspects, too, intrigued her. A conductor accustomed to control, a soprano whose voice could mask a calculating heart, a manager tied to profits, and a rival burning with envy, Each was a thread in the tapestry she must unravel, as she folded a shawl into the suitcase. Miss Marple considered the studio itself. Raymond had described it as a loft, cluttered with the tools of creation: pianos, scores, perhaps a stray violin, a place of solitude, yet invaded by violence. She wondered about the manuscripts, the lifeblood of a composer. Had one been taken, destroyed, or was the motive simpler: passion, greed, or fear? The truth, she thought, lies in the details, the small discords others overlook. The village clock chimed 4, and Miss Marple glanced at the timetable on her desk. The next train to London left in an hour. She penned a quick reply to Raymond, promising to arrive by evening, then rang for Cherry to arrange a cab to the station. As she fastened her hat, her reflection in the mirror showed a frail figure. Her white hair neatly pinned, her expression serene. But beneath that calm lay a mind as keen as a blade, honed by years of observing human nature in its quietest corners. Murder, she said to herself, stepping into the hall, is a performance, and every performer leaves a trace. With that, she closed the door of her cottage and set off for London, where a composer's final note awaited her scrutiny. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. Miss Jane Marple sat in the swaying carriage of the London-bound train. Her small hands folded neatly over her suitcase, her eyes fixed on the fleeting countryside. The fields of St. Mary Mead had given way to the smoke and sprawl of the city's outskirts, but her thoughts remained on the letter from her nephew, Raymond West. Victor Langston, the composer, strangled in his studio with a violin stringer, grim crescendo to a life of music. The details, sparse as they were, stirred her curiosity. For suspects, a cluttered loft, a broken window, and a symphony unfinished. A stage, she murmured, set for tragedy. The train pulled into Paddington Station with a hiss of steam, and Miss Marple, her modest hat firmly pinned, stepped onto the platform. Raymond was there to meet her, his lanky frame and animated gestures unmistakable. "Aunt Jane," he called, weaving through the crowd. "You're a marvel to come so quickly. The police are in a muddle, and I knew you'd see through it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes scanning his eager face. "You flatter me, Raymond, but murder is never so opaque as it seems. Tell me, where is this studio?" Raymond hailed a cab, and as they rattled toward Covent Garden, he recounted the morning's discovery. Langston's housekeeper, a dear woman named Mrs. Tate, had found him at 9 o'clock, slumped over his piano, the violin string tight around his throat. The police, led by Inspector Crane, had cordoned off the studio and detained the 4, who had been present at the previous night's rehearsal: Sir Rowland Havers, the conductor; Clara Vane, the soprano; Edwin Price, the manager; and Felix Mortimer, the rival composer. "They're all denying it, of course," Raymond said, "but the tension at that rehearsal was thick as fog. Langston was a tyrant, they say." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the cast. "A tyrant makes enemies, Raymond, but a violin string suggests something personal, don't you think? Not a weapon one carries by chance." The cab stopped at a narrow street in Covent Garden, where gas lamps flickered against the dusk. The studio was on the top floor of a converted warehouse, its brick facade weathered but proud. A constable stood guard at the entrance, his face stern. Raymond flashed a cardsome connection of his. No doubt, and they were ushered up a creaking staircase to the loft. Inspector Crane awaited them, a stocky man with a clipped mustache and eyes that missed little but understood less. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but sceptical. Mr. West insists you're a sleuth of sorts. I hope you won't mind if I stick to facts." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "Facts are the bricks of truth, though it's the mortar between them that holds the wall together." Crane raised an eyebrow but led her into the studio. The room was vast, its high ceiling crisscrossed with exposed beams. A grand piano dominated one corner, its lid strewn with sheet music. Shelves sagged under books and manuscripts, some spilling onto the floor. A single armchair, upholstered in faded velvet, sat near a small fireplace, its embers cold. A violin case lay open on a table, its contents untouched save for the missing string. And there, by the piano, was the chalk outline where Langston had fallen, a silent testament to his end. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly, taking in every detail. The air smelled of ink, dust, and something sharp of fear, perhaps. Her gaze settled on a broken window across the room, its jagged edges catching the lamplight. "No fingerprints on the string, you say?" she asked. Doc Crane nodded. "None. The killer wore gloves or wiped it clean. We found no signs of a struggle, save for the body itself. Langston was strong, but he didn't fight back. Must have been taken by surprise." Miss Marple stepped closer to the piano, her gloved fingers brushing the keys. A faint discord sounded, and she noted the sheet music atop it, Langston's Symphony No. 7. Its pages annotated in a bold, impatient hand. One page was slightly askew, its corner bent as if hastily replaced. She lifted it gently, revealing a faint smudge of ink, not yet dry. "This was touched recently," she said, more to herself than to Crane. "Probably Langston's own work," Crane said. "He was composing late," Mrs. Tate said. "She heard him playing past midnight." Miss Marple turned to the window, her steps careful on the worn floorboards. The broken glass glittered, and she crouched despite Raymond's quick protest. "Examine the shards." The break was outward, the glass scattered on the ledge below, suggesting force from within. "Curious," she murmured. "A burglar would break in, not out." Crane frowned. "We thought it a ruse to stage a robbery. Nothing was taken, far as we can tell. The manuscripts are all here, and Langston's wallet was untouched." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the shelves, where scores were stacked in disarray. "All here, perhaps, but not all accounted for. A composer's work is his life. If something was taken, it might not be a trinket, but a page, a phrase, a legacy." Raymond, hovering nearby, looked puzzled. "You think someone stole his music?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people kill for what they value most. And for a composer, what is more precious than his creation?" She moved to the violin case, its wood polished but scratched, as if handled often. The missing string had come from this instrument, Crane confirmed, a spare kept in the case. "It was no ordinary string," he added. "Gut, not steel. Old-fashioned. Like Langston himself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring the scene. Langston at his piano. The killer close by, the string seized in a moment of rage or calculation. She glanced at the fireplace, where a few sheets of paper lay crumpled in the grate, unburned. She retrieved one, smoothing it out. It was a letter, addressed to Langston, its tone sharp. "Your demands are unreasonable. We cannot continue like this." The signature was Edwin Price's. "His manager," Crane said, peering over her shoulder. "Price was here last night, along with the others. They all admit to being at the rehearsal, but claim they left Langston alive." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "And what did they say of the rehearsal?" Crane consulted his notebook. Sir Roland Hivers said he argued with Langston over the symphony's tempo, called him impossible. Clara Vane said she stayed late to discuss a new aria Langston was writing for her. Price was here to settle. Accounts Langston wanted more royalties. And Mortimer, the rival, admitted to a row about their music. Said Langston accused him of plagiarism. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. A busy night then, for visitors, each with a grievance. And yet, only one string. She crossed to the armchair, noting a faint indentation in the cushion, as if someone had sat there recently. A single thread, dark green, clung to the fabric. She plucked it carefully, holding it to the light. Not from Langston's coat. I presume, she asked. Crane shook his head. He was wearing black. We'll check the other's clothing. Miss Marple tucked the thread into her handkerchief. Do, Inspector. Small things tell large stories. She turned her attention to the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of books, music theory, biographies. A worn copy of Faust. One shelf held a row of Langston's own scores, their titles bold. Symphony No. 5, Concerto 4, Violin, Symphony No. 7. The last was incomplete, its final pages blank. She lifted it, noting the weight, the faint scent of fresh ink. This was his masterpiece, Raymond said. Crane nodded. The talk of London. Critics were calling it a revolution. Havers was to conduct it, Vane to sing a solo part. Price was banking on it to fill his coffers, and Mortimer, well, he was green with envy. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Envy is a dangerous note, Inspector. It plays discord in the heart. She stepped back, surveying the room once more. The studio was a portrait of Langston, himself chaotic, brilliant, solitary. Yet it was not solitary last night, for had entered, and one had killed. The violin string, the broken window, the misaligned page, the green thread, they were clues. Small but insistent, like the motifs in a symphony. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced teacup or a too loud laugh could unravel a secret. This studio was no different. Inspector, she said, might I speak with Mrs. Tate, the housekeeper? She found him, you say? Crane nodded, signalling to a constable. Moments later, Mrs. Tate appeared, a wiry woman in her 50s, her face pale and her hands twisting a handkerchief. Oh, ma'am, she said, her voice trembling. It was awful. Mr. Langston, dead like that, his eyes staring. I came at 9, as always, to bring his tea. He was at the piano, the string round his neck. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You heard him playing late, Inspector said. Did you hear anything else? Voices, perhaps? Mrs. Tate hesitated. I live below, you see. I heard the piano till midnight, maybe later. There were voices earlier, during the rehearsal. Loud ones, arguing. But after, it was just the music. I went to bed around 11. And the window, Miss Marple asked, was it broken when you left? Mrs. Tate shook her head. No. Ma'am, it was fine. I'd have noticed. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over the timeline. The rehearsal had ended around 10, the voices raised in anger. Langston played on, alone, until midnight or later. Then, silence. The killer struck. The broken window, the missing string, the crumpled letter, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own voice. Raymond, who had been quiet, spoke up. Aunt Jane, you're seeing something, aren't you? You've got that look. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I see a room, Raymond, that tells a story. A man who lived for his music, surrounded by those who needed him, envied him, or resented him. One of them stayed behind, or returned, and that one left traces, however small. Crane, watching her, seemed less skeptical now. "You think the killer's among the four?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people are rarely what they seem. A conductor may hide rage behind his baton. A singer may mask ambition with tears. A manager may covet more than money, and a rival may steal more than fame. We shall see, Inspector." She glanced once more at the piano, the sheet music, the broken glass. The studio was silent now, but it whispered of secrets. As she followed Crane and Raymond out, her mind was already composing the next movement, piecing together the notes of motive, opportunity, and deceit. Chapter 3. The conductor's baton. Miss Jane Marple stepped into the grand foyer of the Royal Concert Hall, her modest black shoes tapping softly on the polished marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of wax and roses, and the hum of anticipation. For the evening's rehearsal lingered, though now tinged with the shadow of Victor Langston's death. Raymond West had arranged for her to meet Sir Rowland Havers, the conductor whose name carried weight in London's musical circles. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the gilded chandeliers and the portraits of maestros. Past their stern gazes, a reminder of the discipline music demanded. Discipline, she thought, and passion, a dangerous duet. Raymond, at her side, was all nervous energy, his scarf askew as he whispered, "Havers is a lion. Aunt Jane, brilliant, but fierce. Langston's death has shaken him, but he's insisting the memorial concert go on." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the conductor. A man who wielded a baton like a scepter might not take kindly to a composer's demands. She followed Raymond through a side door into the auditorium, where the orchestra was tuning, a cacophony of strings and brass that resolved into a restless harmony. At the podium stood Sir Rowland Havers, a towering figure in a black tailcoat, his silver hair catching the stage lights. His hands, large and expressive, gripped the baton as if it were an extension of his will. He raised it, and the musicians fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. Miss Marple and Raymond slipped into seats at the back, unnoticed. She watched Havers closely, noting the precision of his movements, the way his shoulders tensed as he addressed the orchestra. "We play for Langston," he said, his voice resonant, though strained. "His symphony will be his monument. Begin at the second movement." As the music swelled, Miss Marple's mind wandered to the studio, to the violin string and the broken window. Havers had been there, arguing with Langston over tempo, Raymond had said. A conductor's pride was no small thing, and Langston's reputation for being difficult suggested a clash of egos. She leaned toward Raymond, her voice low. "Tell me, dear, what do you know of Sir Rowland's temperament?" Raymond's eyes gleamed with the gossip he loved to share. "He's a genius, but a tyrant in his own right. Langston pushed him hard-wanted. The symphony faster, bolder. Havers thought it vulgar. They nearly came to blows at the rehearsal, or so the violinists whispered." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A man who controls an orchestra might not relish being controlled. The rehearsal ended, and Havers descended from the podium, his face flushed but composed. Raymond led Miss Marple backstage, where Havers was wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. Up close, he was even more imposing, his eyes a piercing blue, though they softened slightly at Raymond's introduction. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but guarded, "I understand you're assisting the police. A curious hobby for a lady." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanor as unassuming as her plain wool coat. Curiosity is no respecter of age or station, Sir Roland. I find people fascinating, especially those who make beautiful things, like music or murder. Havers's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. Murder is hardly beautiful. Victor was a genius, but a maddening one. His loss is a tragedy for music. They sat in a small office off the stage, its walls lined with posters of past concerts. Miss Marple noted a photograph of Havers and Langston, their smiles stiff, as if posed under duress. "You argued with him, I hear," she said gently. "About the symphony." Havers's hands tightened on the handkerchief. Yes, Victor had no sense of restraint. He wanted the second movement, played at a breakneck pace, showy, not profound. I told him it was pedestrian, a betrayal of his own talent. He didn't take kindly to that. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "And yet you stayed late at the rehearsal. Did you resolve your differences?" Havers hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "I left around 10 after the others." Victor was still at his piano, scribbling notes. "Alive, I assure you." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Of course. A conductor's work is never done, is it? Always shaping, guiding. It must be trying when a composer resists." Havers's jaw tightened. Victor resisted everything. He thought he knew best about tempo, dynamics, even my orchestra. But I didn't kill him. I needed him. His symphony was to be my triumph too. Miss Marple's fingers smoothed her skirt, a gesture that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. She recalled the studio, the ink-smudged page, the green thread on the armchair. Havers's tailcoat was black, but his handkerchief was green, embroidered, with his initials, a coincidence perhaps, but she filed it away. "You admired him then?" she asked. "Admired?" Havers's laugh was short, bitter. "I respected his gift, but he was impossible, demanding, secretive. He'd lock himself in that studio for days, emerging with scores he'd barely let me see until rehearsal. That symphony was his obsession." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Secretive, you say? Did he share his work with others? Miss Vane, perhaps, or Mr. Price?" Havers shrugged. "Clara, maybe. She was his muse, or so she thought. Price was always sniffing around for profit. As for Mortimer," he stopped, his lips thinning. "Felix." Mortimer envied Victor. He'd lurk at rehearsals, watching, listening. I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to steal a page or two. Miss Marple's smile was placid, but her mind raced. Envy, again. A motive that sang in every suspect's story. She rose, thanking Havers for his time. "You've been most helpful, Sir Roland. Music, like truth, requires harmony, does it not?" Havers stood, towering over her. "Harmony is my trade, Miss Marple. I hope you find yours." As she and Raymond left the concert hall, the evening air was cool, the streets alive with theatre. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the green thread, the broken window, the missing string. Havers's pride was evident, his resentment barely veiled. A man who commanded orchestras might not kill for art, but for control. That was another matter. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, breaking her reverie, "you're quiet. What do you think?" Of Havers. She glanced at him, her eyes twinkling. "I think, dear, that a conductor is like a village schoolmaster accustomed to obedience. When defied, he may strike a false note, but whether Sir Roland's note was fatal, we shall see." They walked on, the lights of Covent Garden glowing around them. Miss Marple's mind was a score of its own, each clue a note, each suspect a melody, waiting to resolve into truth. Chapter 4. The soprano's aria. Miss Jane Marple navigated the narrow streets of Covent Garden with Raymond West at her side. The evening air sharp with the promise of autumn. The clamour of theatregoers and street vendors faded as they approached. The discreet entrance to the opera house's backstage quarters, where Clara Vane, the celebrated soprano, awaited. Raymond had secured the meeting through a friend in the opera's management, and Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. A singer, she knew, could weave emotion as deftly as a village gossip spun tales, but beneath the artistry might lie a motive as clear as a high note. The dressing room was a small sanctuary of opulence, its walls draped in crimson velvet, a gilded mirror reflecting the glow of a single lamp. Clara Vane sat at her vanity, her auburn hair cascading in waves, her eyes rimmed with the faint redness of recent tears, or so it seemed. Bouquets of roses, their petals wilting, crowded the room, their scent mingling with perfume. Clara rose as Miss Marple entered, her silk gown rustling, her expression a blend of grief and guarded charm. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a melodic lilt, "Raymond speaks so highly of you. I'm devastated about Victor. To think I sang his music only last night." Miss Marple settled into a plush chair, her hands folded over her handbag, her smile gentle but probing. "A terrible loss, Miss Vane. His music, I understand, was your inspiration. Tell me, how was he when you last saw him?" Clara's fingers toyed with a pearl necklace, her gaze drifting to the mirror. "He was alive, vibrant, at his piano. We were discussing a new aria he'd written for Mia, piece for the symphony's premiere. It was to be my moment, you see. Victor understood my voice like no one else." Miss Marple noted the possessive note in Clara's words, the way her eyes softened at Langston's name. "You stayed late then, after the rehearsal?" Clara nodded, her hands stilling. "Yes, after the others left. Sir Roland was fuming. About tempos, as usual. Edwin Price was pestering Victor about contracts, and Felix Mortimer, well, he was skulking about, jealous as ever. I stayed to talk about the aria. Victor played it for me, and it was divine. I left him at his piano around 10:30. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to a small table beside the vanity, where a programme from the previous night's rehearsal lay, its edges curled. A faint pencil mark caught her attention, a musical phrase scribbled in a hurried hand. "You must have been close to him," she said softly, "to share such moments. Did he confide in you about his work? His fears, perhaps?" Clara's lips parted, then closed. "Victor was private, even with me. He'd lock away his scores, as if someone might steal them. He was paranoid, especially about Felix. He said Felix's new work sounded too much like his own." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the programme, her touch light. "And did you see anything unusual that night? A visitor, perhaps, or something out of place?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the roses, then back to Miss Marple. "Nothing, really. The studio was, as it always was, cluttered, alive with his genius. I heard him playing as I left. The window was whole, the door locked. Behind me." Miss Marple smiled, her mind cataloguing the details. Clara's story was smooth, her grief convincing, but there was a practiced quality to it, like a well-rehearsed aria. She thought of the studio's broken window, the violin string, the green thread on the armchair. Clara's gown was blue tonight, but her shawl, draped over a chair, was a deep emerald. You admired him greatly, Miss Marple said. It must be hard to lose such a collaborator. Clara's eyes welled, a single tear tracing her cheek. He was my muse. Without him, I don't know how I'll sing the premiere, but I will, for him. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, deliberate. You'll sing beautifully, I'm sure. Music, like truth, has a way of rising above sorrow. As they left the dressing room, Raymond whispered, "She's a performer, isn't she?" That tear was perfectly timed. Miss Marple's lips curved. Performers, Raymond, know how to move an audience. But a tear can hide as much as it reveals. Miss Vane loved Langston's music, but love, like envy, can turn sharp. They stepped into the night, the opera house's lights casting long shadows. Miss Marple's mind hummed with questions. Clara's devotion seemed genuine, but her quick glance at the roses suggested a hidden verse. The scribbled program, the emerald shawl, the aria discussed in private, they were notes in a melody she was only beginning to hear. As they walked toward their next destination, she thought of St. Mary Mead, where a tearful widow once hid a secret behind her handkerchief. Clara Vane, she suspected, was singing a part, but the full score remained unwritten. Chapter 5. The manager's ledger Miss Jane Marple stepped into the dimly lit office of Edwin Price, Victor Langston's manager, situated in a cramped building off Drury Lane. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and old paper, and the walls were lined with posters of past concerts, their edges yellowed. A single lamp cast shadows across a desk buried under ledgers, contracts, and a typewriter that looked as weary as its owner. Price himself was a wiry man, his suit slightly rumpled, his fingers twitching as he greeted Miss Marple and Raymond West. His eyes, sharp but restless, darted to the door as if expecting an interruption. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "I'm told you're poking about Victor's death. A nasty business. I'm at your service, though I've little to add." Miss Marple settled into a creaking chair, her handbag resting on her lap, her expression as serene as a village vicar's wife. "You're very kind, Mr. Price. A manager's work is so vital, isn't it? Keeping the wheels turning behind the music. You must have known Mr. Langston well." Price gave a tight smile, his fingers drumming the desk. "Well enough. Victor was a gold mine, but a difficult one. Always demanding more royalties, more control. He didn't understand the business. Sighed only the art." Miss Marple's eyes, keen behind her spectacles, noted the clutter on the desk. A ledger open to a page marked with red ink, a crumpled receipt tucked under a paperweight, and a half-empty glass of whiskey. She recalled the letter found in studio, its tone sharp with financial strain. "You were at the rehearsal the night he died," she said gently. "Arguing about money, I believe." Price's fingers stilled, and he leaned back, his chair squeaking. "Arguing, hardly. Victor was pushing for a bigger cut of the symphony's profits. Said it was his masterpiece, worth more than I offered. I told him the market's tight, critics don't pay bills. We left it at that." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "And you left the studio when?" 10, maybe 10:15, Price said, his eyes flicking to the ledger. The others were still there, Havers, ranting about tempo. Clara cooing over her aria, Mortimer lurking like a vulture. Victor was at his piano, scribbling away. I had a late meeting across town. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the receipt, its edges curling. "A meeting, you say?" At such an hour, Price's jaw tightened. Business doesn't keep regular hours. Miss Marple, promoter, wanted to discuss the symphony's tour. I took a cab, got back to my flat around midnight. She nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her handbag. The receipt, she noted, was for a cab fare. Time stamped at 11:45 p.m. from an address near Langston's studio. A late meeting, perhaps, but the timing was close to close. She thought of the studio's broken window, the violin string, the green thread. Price's suit was grey, but a scarf, folded haphazardly on a coat rack, was a muted green. You managed Victor's finances, she said. His success must have been yours, too. Price snorted, reaching for the whiskey. Success? Victor's demands were bleeding me dry. Every score came with a tantrum, more money, more rights, but he was my star. Without him, I'm scrambling. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. Scrambling, perhaps, but resourceful. Did Victor share his new symphony with you? Or was he as secretive as Sir Roland suggested? Price hesitated, his glass pausing mid-air. He was cagey. Kept the score locked in his desk, showed it only to Clara for her aria. Even I didn't see the full thing until rehearsal. Said it was too precious to risk. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her question hung in the air. From whom? Price shrugged, setting the glass down. Felix Mortimer, for one. Victor thought he was sniffing around, trying to steal. Ideas. They had a row that night, Felix accusing Victor of hogging the spotlight, Victor calling Felix a hack. It got heated. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. Envy, again, threading through every account. She glanced at the ledger, its red ink stark, and the symphony's profits, she said. They were substantial. Price's eyes narrowed, potentially. The premiere was sold out, promoters circling. But Victor wanted half up front, which I couldn't manage. He didn't understand cash flow. Miss Marple smiled faintly, thinking of St. Mary Mead, where a butcher's unpaid bill once led to a bitter feud. Money, like music, could stir deep passions. She rose, her movements slow. You've been most helpful, Mr. Price. A manager's burden is heavy, balancing art and commerce. It must weigh on the conscience, too. Price's face darkened, but he said nothing, only nodded as she and Raymond left the office. In the corridor, Raymond whispered, "He's nervous, isn't he? That receipt, did you see it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I did, dear. A cab at 11:45, so near the studio. And that scarf green, like the thread in the armchair. Small things, Raymond, but they whisper." As they stepped into the cool night, the lights of Drury Lane flickering, Miss Marple's mind turned over the ledger's red ink, the late cab, the strained letter. Price's loyalty to Langston was tied to profit, but profit could turn to desperation. Like a villager hoarding gossip, he held secrets, and she would coax them out, note by note. Chapter 6. The rival's shadow miss, Jane Marple, sat at a small Rottian table outside a bustling Covent Garden cafe, the clink of teacups and the murmur of passers-by forming a lively backdrop. The afternoon sun filtered through the plane trees, casting dappled shadows on her neatly pressed coat. Raymond West, ever impatient, fidgeted beside her, his eyes scanning the crowd for Felix Mortimer, the rival composer whose name had surfaced in every suspect's account, tinged with bitterness or suspicion. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her demeanour as calm as her St. Mary Mead garden, but her mind was alert, piecing together the fragments of Victor Langston's Murder the Violin String. The broken window, the green thread, the smudged manuscript. Felix is late, Raymond muttered, checking his watch. Typical artist, I suppose, always brooding. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Artists, Raymond, are like village poets. Their passions run deep, and their grudges deeper. Mr. Mortimer, I suspect, has much to say, even if he guards. His words, as if summoned, Felix Mortimer appeared, weaving through the crowd with a lanky grace. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark, unkempt hair and eyes that burned with a restless intensity. His coat was threadbare at the cuffs, and his hands, stained faintly with ink, clutched a rolled-up score. He sank into the chair opposite, his gaze wary. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "Raymond says you're looking into Victor's death. I'll help if I can, but I've told the police everything." Miss Marple set her teacup down, her eyes gentle but piercing. "You're very kind, Mr. Mortimer. A composer's life must be solitary, yet Victor Langston's was crowded with admirers and rivals. You were at his studio the night he died, I believe." Mortimer's fingers tightened on the score, his knuckles whitening. "Yes, at the rehearsal. It was a circus havers barking orders, Clara preening, Price counting his coins. Victor was in his element, lording it over us all with that symphony of his." Miss Marple noted the edge in his voice, the way his eyes flicked away when he mentioned, "Langston, you argued with him, I hear, about your work." Mortimer's jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Victor accused me of copying him. Said my new concerto echoed his style too closely. It's nonsense. I've been working on it for months, long before his precious symphony, no, 7. But he wouldn't listen. He called me a parasite in front of everyone." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind catalogued the venom in his words. "That must have stung," she said softly. "To be so dismissed, when your own talent is clear. Did you stay to resolve it?" Mortimer hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the score. "I stayed after the others left. Yes, around 10, maybe later. I wanted to clear the air, prove my work was my own. We argued again, but I left him alive, Miss Marple. He was at his piano, scribbling, as always." She tilted her head, her eyes lingering on the ink stains on his fingers, faint but unmistakable. "And the studio, anything unusual?" "The window, perhaps, or his manuscripts." Mortimer's gaze flickered, then steadied. "The window was fine when I left. His manuscripts were everywhere, as usual. He was obsessive about that symphony, kept it under lock and key, said it was his legacy." Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag, where she kept the green thread from the studio's armchair. Mortimer's coat was a faded brown, but a scarf, loosely knotted around his neck, was a dark forest green. "You admired his work, then?" she asked. "Admired?" Mortimer's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Victor was a genius, but he hoarded the spotlight. My concerto could have rivaled his symphony, but no one would listen while he was alive. Now," he trailed off, his eyes darkening. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the studio, the broken window, the misaligned page, the violin string. Mortimer's resentment was palpable, his ambition a shadow trailing Langston's fame. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a spurned suitor once nursed a grudge into something darker. "You're a composer, Mr. Mortimer," she said. "Your music is your voice. Did Victor's ever drown it out?" Mortimer's hands stilled, and for a moment he looked vulnerable, almost boyish. Every day he had the critics, the patrons, the stage. I was always second, but I didn't kill him. I wanted to beat him, not bury him. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving his. Of course, competition sharpens the spirit, doesn't it? Like a well-tuned string. As they rose to leave, she noticed a scrap of paper fall from Mortimer's score, a fragment with a musical phrase inked in a hurried hand. She stooped to retrieve it, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention. The notes were unfamiliar, but their rhythm echoed the smudged page in Langston's studio. "Yours?" she asked, holding it out. Mortimer snatched it back, his face flushing. "Just a sketch. I'm always writing." Miss Marple nodded, her mind humming. The cafe's noise faded as she and Raymond walked back toward Covent Garden's heart, the lights twinkling against the dusk. "He's hiding something," Raymond said, his voice eager. "That paper, did you see how he grabbed it?" "I did, dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "And his fingers, stained with ink, like the smudge on Victor's score. His scarf, too, green as the thread we found. Envy, Raymond, is a melody that plays in the heart, and Mr. Mortimer's tune is a troubled one." They paused by a flower stall, the scent of roses sharp in the air. Miss Marple's thoughts wove together the clues to string, the window, the thread, the score. Mortimer's ambition was a fire, but had it burned hot enough to kill? Like a village outsider craving acceptance, he stood on the edge of Langston's world, yearning for what he could not have. The fragment of music, the ink, the green scarf, they were notes in a score she was only beginning to read, but their cadence pointed to a truth still hidden in the shadows. Chapter 7. The Score's Secret. Miss Jane Marple sat in the quiet of her temporary lodgings in London, a modest room at a boarding house near Covent Garden, where the faint hum of the city drifted through the window. The evening was cool, and she had draped a shawl over her shoulders, her knitting untouched on the table beside her. In her hands was a small notebook, its pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting observations from the studio, the interviews, the clues that danced, like notes in a half-written symphony. The violin string, the broken window, the green thread, the ink-smudged manuscript, and now the fragment of music from Felix Mortimer's squirrel were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to Victor Langston's murder. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on a single phrase in her notes. Symphony No. 7. Incomplete. Raymond West had left her to attend a literary soirée, promising to return with any gossip from London's artistic circles. Miss Marple welcomed the solitude, for it allowed her to think, to weave the threads of the case as carefully as she knitted her scarves. The studio, she mused, was the heart of the matter, a place of creation turned to destruction. The missing pages of Langston's symphony, hinted at by the misaligned sheet and the suspect's guarded words, were a clue she could not ignore. A composer's score, she murmured, is his soul. To steal it is to steal his life. Determined to revisit the scene, she donned her coat and hat, her movements brisk despite the late hour. A cab took her to the warehouse in Covent Garden, where a lone constable stood guard, his lantern casting a soft glow. Recognizing her from Inspector Crane's instructions, he allowed her into the studio, though his expression was dubious. "Mind the glass, ma'am," he said, pointing to the broken window. "Haven't cleaned it up yet." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes already scanning the loft. The grand piano stood silent, its keys untouched since Langston's death. The shelves, cluttered with manuscripts, seemed to whisper of his genius, but also of his secrecy. She approached the piano, her gloved fingers lifting the sheet music for Symphony No. 7. The pages were numbered, but the sequence ended abruptly. Pages 47 to 50 were missing, their absence marked by a faint tear at the binding. She ran her finger along the edge, noting a trace of ink still tacky, as if the pages had been torn recently. "Curious," she said softly, her mind turning to Felix, Mortimer's ink-stained fingers, and the musical fragment he'd snatched back at the cafe. She set the score down and moved to the desk, where a small drawer caught her eye. It was locked, but the wood around the keyhole was scratched, as if someone had pried it open. With a hairpin from her bagger trick learned from a St. Mary Mead locksmith, she coaxed the drawer open. Inside was a single sheet, not music, but a letter, written in Langston's bold hand. It read, "Felix, your imitation is flattery, but theft is a crime. My symphony is mine alone. Cease, or I'll expose you." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The letter confirmed the rivalry, but also Langston's fear of theft. Had Mortimer acted to protect his reputation, or to claim Langston's work as his own? She tucked the letter into her bag, her thoughts shifting to the other suspects. Sir Roland Hivers had resented Langston's control, Clara Vane had coveted his aria, and Edwin Price had chafed under financial strain. Each had a motive, but the missing pages pointed most directly to Mortimer. She crossed to the broken window, the night air sharp through the jagged gap. The glass, she noted again, was shattered outward, a detail that nagged at her. A burglar would break in, not out, unless the break was meant to mislead. She crouched, her knees protesting, and examined the sill. A faint smudge of ink marred the wood, matching the stains on Mortimer's fingers. "A careless composer," she murmured, "or a desperate one." Returning to the piano, she sat on the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. She pressed a note, its sound echoing in the silent loft. The music stand held another Kluwer pencil, its tip worn, lying beside a blank sheet with a single musical phrase, not in Langston's hand, but in a tighter, more angular script. It matched the fragment from Mortimer's score, a sequence of notes that echoed Langston's style, yet diverged in subtle ways. A shadow of his work, she thought, but with its own voice. Miss Marple rose, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The missing pages, the letter, the ink, the window, they all pointed to a theft gone wrong, a rivalry turned fatal. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a stolen recipe had led to a bitter feud, and saw parallels here. Mortimer's ambition, Havers's pride, Clara's devotion, Price's greed, each was a note in the discord of Langston's death. She left the studio, thanking the constable, and stepped into the cool night. The streets of Covent Garden were quieter now, the theatres emptying. As she walked, her thoughts turned to the suspect's stories. Havers claimed he left at 10, Clara at past, Price at 10:15, and Mortimer after a heated row. Mrs. Tate, the housekeeper, had heard Langston playing past midnight. The killer, then, had struck late, after the others claimed to have gone. But the broken window, the ink, the missing pages suggested someone had lingered or returned. Back at her lodgings, Miss Marple lit a lamp and opened her notebook. She sketched a timeline, her pen moving with precision. The green thread, she noted, could belong to any of them: Havers's handkerchief, Clara's shawl, Price's scarf, or Mortimer's. But the ink, the musical fragment, and the letter pointed most strongly to Mortimer. Yet she hesitated, her instincts warning her against haste. People, she thought, are like scores, complex, layered. The truth lies in the silences between the notes. She closed her notebook, her eyes drifting to the window. Tomorrow, she would press the suspects further, seeking the discord that betrayed the killer. For now, the studio's secrets, the torn pages, the inked sill, the locked drawer sang to her, a melody of motive and deceit that she was determined to resolve. Chapter 8. The broken window. Miss Jane Marple sat in the quiet of her Covent Garden boarding house, the early morning light filtering through the lace curtains. A tray of tea and toast lay untouched on the table, her attention fixed on her notebook, where the clues of Victor Langston's murder were meticulously recorded. The violin string, the green thread, the ink-smudged manuscript, the missing pages of Symphony No. 7, and the letter accusing Felix Mortimer of theft. Yet it was the broken window in Langston's studio that now held her focus. Its outward shattered glass, a discordant note in the melody of the crime. A window broken from within, she murmured, is no accident. It tells a story of panic. Raymond West had promised to join her later, but Miss Marple, restless with the puzzle, decided to return to the studio alone. She dressed in her usual sober attire, pinning her hat with care, and took a cab to the warehouse. The constable on duty, recognizing her, nodded wearily as she ascended the creaking stairs. The studio was unchanged, its air still heavy with dust and the faint tang of ink. The grand piano loomed in the corner, the manuscripts lay scattered, and the broken window gaped like a wound, letting in a chill breeze. Miss Marple approached the window, her steps deliberate. The jagged glass, scattered on the outer sill, confirmed her earlier observation. The break was outward, not inward. She crouched, ignoring the protest of her knees, and examined the sill closely. The ink smudge she'd noted before was still. There, a faint black mark, but now she saw something else, a tiny fleck of green paint, caught in a splinter of wood. It was not the green of the thread from the armchair, but a brighter hue, like the paint on the window frame itself. Curious, she said softly, as if the frame was struck in haste. She straightened, her eyes tracing the room's layout. The window was across from the piano, near the desk where the locked drawer had held Langston's accusing letter. If someone had broken the window to stage a burglary, why outward? And why no other signs of theft, save the missing pages? She moved to the desk, her gloved fingers brushing the scratched keyhole. The letter, now in her bag, had pointed to Mortimer, but the window suggested a broader story. A distraction, she thought, or a mistake. Miss Marple sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The sheet music for Symphony No. 7 lay before her, its torn binding a silent accusation. She recalled Mortimer's ink-stained fingers, Clara Vane's emerald shawl, Price's green scarf, Havers's handkerchief. The green thread could belong to any, but the ink in the missing pages kept circling back to Mortimer. Yet the window nagged at her, its outward break a clue that refused to align. She rose and crossed to the armchair, where the green thread had been found. The cushions still bore a faint indentation, as if someone had sat there, watching or waiting. She examined the thread again, now safely in her handkerchief, and noted its texture fine, like silk, not coarse, like wool. Clara's shawl was silk, she recalled, but so was Havers's handkerchief. Price's scarf was wool, and Mortimer's was cotton. A small distinction, she mused, but details matter. Returning to the window, she leaned out carefully, peering at the ledge below. A narrow alley ran beneath, its cobblestones littered with glass shards. She spotted something else, a cigarette butt, its tip stained with a faint red, like lipstick. Clara Vane, she remembered, smoked, her dressing room littered with cigarette cases. But had she been outside the studio that night? Her story placed her inside, leaving at 10:30. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind humming. Back inside, she noticed a small brass key on the floor, half hidden under a rug near the desk. It was scratched, like the drawer's lock, and she tested it. It fit perfectly. Someone was careless, she thought, or in a hurry. The key suggested the killer had accessed the drawer, perhaps to find the letter or the missing pages. But why leave it behind? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Inspector Crane appeared, his moustache twitching with surprise. "Miss Marple, you're up early. Found anything?" She smiled, slipping the key into her bag. "Only small things, Inspector. A fleck of paint, a cigarette butt, a key. But they may sing in time." Crane frowned, following her to the window. "You're still on about that glass. I say, it's a clumsy attempt to fake a break-in, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But a burglary staged from within suggests a mind at work, one that planned, then faltered. Tell me, have you checked the suspect's clothing for glass or paint?" Crane nodded. "We're looking. Nothing yet. Mortimer's coat had ink stains, though, and his flat's a mess of manuscripts. Havers's handkerchief was clean, Vane's shawl had no glass, and Price's scarf was wool, not silk." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Silk, you say? The thread I found was silk, a small detail, but it narrows the field." Crane scratched his chin, his skepticism softening. "You've a knack for this, I'll give you that. What's your theory?" "No theory yet, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle. "Only questions. The window, the key, the pages, they're like notes in a score, waiting for the right tempo. I'd like to speak to Mr. Mortimer again, if I may." Crane agreed, promising to arrange it. As Miss Marple left the studio, the morning sun was rising, casting long shadows across the alley. She paused by the cigarette butt, its red stain vivid against the cobblestones. A woman's touch, she thought, or a man's deception. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced hairpin had once unravelled a lie. Here, a cigarette might do the same. Back at her lodgings, she added to her notebook: green paint, cigarette with red stain, brass key, silk thread. The window's outward break suggested a killer inside the studio, perhaps startled into breaking. The key pointed to the desk, the letter to Mortimer, but the cigarette hinted at Clara. The truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of these clues, like a chord resolving a melody. As she sipped her now cold tea, Miss Marple felt the case tightening, its notes aligning into a pattern she could almost hear. Chapter 9. The Rehearsal's Echoes. Miss Jane Marple stood in the shadowed wings of the Royal Concert Hall, her slight figure nearly lost amid the bustle of stagehands and musicians preparing for the memorial rehearsal of Victor Langston's symphony. No. 7. The auditorium was half lit, its velvet seats empty save for a few critics and patrons who had come to pay their respects, or to gauge the scandal's impact. The air hummed with anticipation, but also with an undercurrent of unease, as if the notes of Langston's music carried the weight of his untimely death. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the scene. Sir Rowland Haven at the podium, his baton poised, Clara Vane warming her voice in a corner, Edwin Price pacing near the stage door, and Felix Mortimer seated in the front row, his face a mask of brooding intensity. Raymond West, at her side, whispered, "This is it. Aunt Jane, the whole lot of them, together again. If the killer's here, they're bound to slip up." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "People do, Raymond, when the spotlight is on. A rehearsal is like a village fete everyone performs, but their true selves peek through in the pauses." Her notebook, tucked in her handbag, held the clues that had accumulated: the violin string, the green thread, the ink-smudged manuscript, the missing pages, the brass key, the green paint, and the cigarette butt with its red stain. Each was a note in the score of Langston's murder, and tonight she hoped to hear their harmony or discord. She had arranged, through Inspector Crane, to observe the suspects during the rehearsal, believing the music and the setting might stir their emotions, revealing what their words concealed. As the orchestra tuned, a restless cacophony of strings and woodwinds, Miss Marple moved to a seat in the shadows, her presence unnoticed by the suspects. Havers raised his baton, and the first notes of the symphony swelled, a haunting melody that seemed to echo Langston's passion and pride. Clara's voice joined in, her solo aria soaring, its clarity almost masking the tremor. Miss Marple detected a hint of strain, perhaps fear. Havers conducted with fierce precision, his silver hair glinting under the stage lights, but his shoulders were tense, his glances sharp toward Clara and Price. Price, standing near the wings, tapped his foot, his eyes darting to his watch as if calculating profits. Mortimer sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the score in his lap. Miss Marple noted the faint ink stains still on his fingers, and the green scarf loosely knotted at his throat. During a pause, as Havers corrected a violinist's phrasing, Miss Marple slipped into the orchestra pit, her movements quiet but purposeful. Among the discarded programs and rosin dust, she spotted a crumpled sheet, its edge torn. She retrieved it, smoothing it out under the dim light. It was a rehearsal schedule, annotated in a hurried hand. Mortimer's, she suspected, from the angular script. A single line stood out, a musical phrase, identical to the fragment she'd seen fall from his score at the cafe, and eerily similar to Langston's style. "A shadow of his work," she murmured, tucking the paper into her handbag. Returning to her seat, she watched Clara, whose aria had resumed. The soprano's face was radiant, but her hands twisted a silk handkerchief emerald green, like her shawl. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cigarette butt with its red stain, found outside the studio. Clara smoked, and her lipstick was a vivid scarlet. Had she lingered outside, watching, waiting? Her story of leaving at 10:30 felt too neat, like a rehearsed line. As the rehearsal ended, the musicians dispersed, and Miss Marple approached Mortimer, who lingered in the auditorium, his score clutched tightly. "Mr. Mortimer," she said, her voice gentle, "the symphony is magnificent, isn't it? A pity its pages are incomplete." Mortimer's eyes narrowed, but he forced a smile. "It's Langston's best. I told you, I respected him, even if we clashed. Those missing pages, someone must have taken them, but it wasn't me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. "You were in the studio late, you said, arguing about theft, and yet I found a musical phrase in your hand, so like his, and ink on your fingers, like the smudge on his desk. You wanted his score, didn't you?" Mortimer's face paled, his hands tightening on the score. "I wanted to beat him, not steal from him. I told you I left him alive. You're fishing, Miss Marple." She smiled, undeterred. "Perhaps, but the window, broken outward, suggests someone inside was desperate. And the key to his desk, did you find what you sought? Mortimer's voice dropped to a hiss. I didn't touch his desk. I argued. I left. That's all. Miss Marple nodded, letting him go, but her mind was racing. The schedule, the ink, the green scarf, they pointed to Mortimer, yet the cigarette butt and Clara's handkerchief tugged her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a stray glove had betrayed a thief. Here the clues were scattered, like notes waiting for the right conductor. She joined Raymond outside, where the night air was crisp, the stars hidden by city lights. Aunt Jane, he said, you rattled Mortimer. Did you see his face? I did, dear, she replied, her tone mild. But a rattled man isn't always guilty. The rehearsal showed me their masks. Havis's control, Clara's emotion, Price's calculation, Mortimer's envy. One of them played a fatal note, and the clues are singing, if we listen. As they walked toward her lodgings, Miss Marple thoughts wove the fragments together. The schedule's musical phrase, the cigarette's red stain. The green paint on the sill, they were a melody of motive, leading her closer to the truth. Chapter 10. The motive unraveled. Miss Jane Marple sat in the modest parlour of her Covent Garden boarding house, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains and casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet. Her notebook lay open on the table, its pages dense with her precise handwriting, each entry a clue in the intricate score of Victor Langston's murder. The violin string, the green thread, the ink-smudged manuscript, the missing pages of Symphony No. 7, the brass key, the green paint, the cigarette butt with its red stain, and the annotated rehearsal schedule. The pieces were aligning, their notes forming a melody that pointed toward a single truth, though Miss Marple knew better than to rush the final chord. Truth, she murmured, is like a symphony, it requires patience to hear its resolution. Raymond. West had telephoned earlier, promising to join her after a meeting with a music critic who claimed to have overheard tensions at Langston's rehearsal. Miss Marple, however, preferred the quiet of her thoughts, her mind sifting through the suspect stories and the studio's secrets. Felix Mortimer's ink-stained fingers and the musical phrase on the crumpled schedule echoed Langston's. Work too closely to be coincidence. Clara Vane's scarlet lipstick matched the cigarette butt outside the studio, and her silk handkerchief shared the green hue of the thread. Edwin Price's late-night cab receipt placed him near the crime, and Sir Rowland Havers's pride chafed against Langston's control. Yet the broken window shattered outward, and the brass key to the desk suggested a calculated act gone awry, theft, perhaps, that turned to murder. Determined to test her emerging theory, Miss Marple arranged, through Inspector Crane, to meet Mortimer once more, this time at his modest flat near Soho. She arrived alone, her black coat and hat blending into the grey morning, her handbag clutched firmly. Mortimer's building was shabby, its staircase narrow and creaking, the air heavy with the scent of damp plaster and stale coffee. He opened the door, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with fatigue or fear. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "you're persistent. I've told you everything." She smiled, settling into a threadbare chair in his cluttered parlour, where manuscripts spilled across a table, their pages marked with frantic corrections. "Not quite everything, Mr. Mortimer," she said gently. "A composer's work is his heart, and yours, I think, beat closely to Victor Langston's. That musical phrase, I son, your schedule, in your score it was his, wasn't it?" Mortimer's hands trembled, and he sank onto a stool, his ink-stained fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You're relentless," he muttered. Yes, I admired his work. Who wouldn't? But I didn't steal it. My concerto is my own. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was unwavering. Yet you were in his studio, late, after the rehearsal. You argued about theft, and the desk's key was left behind, its drawer scratched. You sought his score, didn't you? To prove your worth, or to claim it? Mortimer's face flushed, and he stood, pacing the small room. I wanted to see it, yes. His symphony. No. 7. Everyone said it was a masterpiece. I thought if I could study it, I'd understand why he always overshadowed me. I went back after 10, used the key he kept under a book. He caught me at the desk, laughed in my face, called me a thief. We fought not with fists, but words. I left him alive, I swear. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the window's green paint, the outward break, and the window. Did you break it to make it look like a burglary? Mortimer froze, his eyes wide. No, it was whole when I left. I didn't touch it. She tilted her head, her voice calm but probing. But you took pages, didn't you? Pages 47 to 50, torn from the score, and the ink on the cilia ink from your fingers. Mortimer's shoulders slumped, and he sank back onto the stool, his voice barely a whisper. I took them. I couldn't help it. He was mocking me, saying I'd never match him. I grabbed the pages and ran, but I didn't kill him. I heard the piano as I left, past 11. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag, where the brass key and the crumpled schedule rested. Mortimer's confession explained the missing pages, but not the violin string, nor the cigarette butt with Clara's red stain. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a stolen letter had led to a confrontation, but not always to murder. You wanted his legacy, she said softly, but someone else took his life. Who else was there? Mr. Mortimer. Did you see Clara, perhaps outside? Mortimer shook his head, but his eyes flickered with doubt. I didn't see her, but she was always hovering, wanting his attention. She smoked, always dropping those red-stained butts. Miss Marple rose, her expression serene. Thank you, Mr. Mortimer. The truth, like music, has its own rhythm. We're close to hearing it. She left the flat, her thoughts racing. Mortimer's theft was clear, but the murder required a colder hand. The cigarette butt suggested Clara, but her story placed her inside, leaving at 10:30. Price's cab at 11:45 kept him in the frame, and Havers's pride could not be dismissed. The window, though, was the key broken outward with green paint and ink. Mortimer's panic might have led to the break, but the violin string suggested a more intimate act. She met Inspector Crane at a nearby tea shop, where he was waiting with a file of new evidence. We searched Mortimer's flat, he said, his mustache twitching. Found pages 47 to 50 of the symphony hidden in a drawer. Ink matches the smudge on the desk, but no violin string, no green paint. Miss Marple nodded, producing the brass key. This was left in the studio, Inspector. It fits the desk, and the cigarette butt outside dread lipstick, like Miss Vane's. We must speak to her again. Crane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. You're building something, Miss Marple. I'll arrange it. As they parted, Miss Marple walked through Soho's bustling streets, her mind weaving the clues into a score. Mortimer stole the pages, but the window and the string pointed to a second actor, murder born of rage or fear. Clara's cigarette, Havers's control, crisis, desperation, they were all notes in the melody, but one played the fatal chord. Like a village scandal unraveled by a misplaced word, the truth was close, its rhythm pulsing in the shadows. Chapter 11. The Confession. Miss Jane Marple sat in the small, dimly lit interview room at Scotland Yard, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, her eyes calm but piercing behind her spectacles. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and ink, and the faint hum of London's evening traffic filtered through a high window. Across from her sat Felix Mortimer, his lanky frame hunched, his ink-stained fingers twisting nervously. Inspector Crane stood by the door, his mustache twitching with a mix of skepticism and anticipation. The evidence pages 47 to 50 of Symphony. No. 7. The brass key, the crumpled rehearsal schedule, and the ink smudge on the studio's windowsill had tightened the net around Mortimer. But Miss Marple knew the melody of murder was not yet complete. The violin string, the green thread, the cigarette butt with its red stain, and the green paint fleck on the sill were notes still unresolved, their harmony pointing to a truth she was determined to uncover. Mr. Mortimer, Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm. You've admitted to taking Victor Langston's score, a grave act, but not murder. Yet the studio tells a story, the broken window, the ink, the key left behind. You were there, late, in a rage. Tell me, what happened after you took those pages? Mortimer's eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, met hers briefly before dropping to the table. I told you, Miss Marple. I took the pages and left. Victor was alive at his piano, mocking me. I didn't touch him. I didn't break the window. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression as serene as a St. Mary Mead vicar's wife. But you were desperate, weren't you? His symphony overshadowed your concerto, his laughter stung your pride, and the window broken outward with your ink on the sill. Did you panic, perhaps, after a struggle? Mortimer's hands clenched, his voice rising. No struggle. I grabbed the pages, yes, but I didn't touch him. The window was whole when I left, I swear. I was out by 11, maybe later. I heard his piano as I went down the stairs. Crane stepped forward, his tone sharp. Your flat had the pages, Mortimer, and your ink matches the desk and the sill. You expect us to believe you just walked away. Mortimer's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands. I'm a thief, not a killer. I wanted his notes, his genius, to understand it. He caught me, laughed, said I'd never be him. I took the pages and ran, but I didn't kill him. Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag, where the green thread and the brass key rested. She recalled the cigarette butt outside the studio, its red stain like Clara Vane's lipstick, and the green paint fleck, so unlike the silk thread. Mr. Mortimer, she said softly, you saw no one else. Miss Vane, perhaps, lingering outside. She smokes, you know, and leaves those red-tipped butts. Mortimer's head jerked up, his eyes flickering with something new, recognition or fear. Clara, no, I didn't see her, but she was always there, fawning over Victor, wanting his music for herself. She'd do anything for that aria. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the clues into a tighter pattern. She turned to Crane. Inspector, might we bring in Miss Vane? Her story, I think, has a verse yet unsung. Crane agreed, and within the hour, Clara Vane was ushered into the room, her elegance undimmed despite the late hour. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, her silk gown a soft blue, but her hands clutched a green silk handkerchief, its hue matching. the thread from the studio's armchair. Her eyes, red-rimmed as if from tears, darted to Mortimer, then to Miss Marple. "This is absurd," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "I've told you I left Victor at 10:30, alive and playing." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her gaze was unrelenting. "Miss Vane, your aria was to be the heart of his symphony, was it not? A gift from Victor, but one he guarded closely. Did you, perhaps, want it for yourself? Enough to linger outside, to watch, to act?" Clara's lips parted, her handkerchief twisting. "I loved Victor's music. I'd never harm him. I left the studio, as I said. I smoked a cigarette outside, yes, but then I went home." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the handkerchief, then back to Clara's face. "And yet, a cigarette butt with red lipstick was found in the alley under the broken window. And your handkerchief silk, green, like the thread in the studio. Did you return, Miss Vane, after Mortimer left?" Clara's face paled, but she shook her head. "No, I was home by 11. "Ask my maid," Crane interjected, holding up a report. "Your maid says you were out until midnight, Miss Vane, and we found a green silk shawl in your dressing room with a speck of green paint. Care to explain?" Clara's composure cracked, her voice rising. "I didn't kill him. Yes, I stayed late, outside, smoking. I was upset. Victor promised me the aria, then said he might give it to another soprano. I waited, hoping to change his mind. But I didn't go back in." Miss Marple's mind raced, the clues aligning like a crescendo. Mortimer's theft, Clara's. Lingering, the broken window. It was a sequence, but the violin string was the final note. She turned to Mortimer, her voice soft but commanding. "Mr. Mortimer, you took the pages, but you saw something, didn't you? As you left, through the alley, you saw Miss Vane or someone else." Mortimer's eyes widened, his breath catching. I saw a shadow near the alley. I thought it was Clara, smoking, but I didn't stop. I was scared, with the pages. In my coat." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. "And the string, Mr. Mortimer, did you see it in Victor's hand, perhaps, as you argued?" Mortimer's voice broke, a sob escaping. "He was holding it, yes, taunting me. Said he'd play my concerto on it and show the world I was nothing. I grabbed the pages, pushed him away, and ran, but I didn't strangle him." The room fell, silent, the weight of his words settling. Miss Marple's thoughts crystallized. Mortimer stole the pages, pushed Langston, and fled, leaving the composer alive but enraged, holding the violin string. Clara, outside, smoking, saw her chancellor. Someone else did. The green paint, the outward break, suggested a hasty exit, not a staged burglary. And the string, so personal, pointed to a moment of passion. She turned to Crane. "Inspector, the string was the key. Victor held it, perhaps as a taunt, and someone used it against him. Not Mr. Mortimer, who fled, but someone who returned." Crane's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Vane?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. We need the paint analyzed, and Miss Vane's shawl checked for glass. But the truth is close, Inspector. Like a village secret, it's whispered." In the details, as Mortimer and Clara were led away, Miss Marple sat back, her mind humming. The confession had clarified the theft, but the murder's final note, strangled by a string held in Langston's own hand, pointed to a killer who seized a moment of rage. In St. Mary Mead, a spurned lover had once turned a gesture of affection into betrayal. Here, the string told a similar tale, and Miss Marple was determined to name its player. Chapter 12. The Final Note. Miss Jane Marple sat in the hushed grandeur of the Royal Concert Hall, her slight figure tucked into a seat at the back of the auditorium, her eyes fixed on the stage where the memorial performance of Victor Langston's Symphony No. 7 was about to begin. The hall was filled with London's elite, their murmurs a soft undercurrent to the tuning of the orchestra. The air was heavy with anticipation, but for Miss Marple it was charged with the weight of an unresolved melody, the murder of Langston, strangled with a violin string in his studio, the clues now forming a crescendo in her mind. Her notebook, tucked in her handbag, held the final pieces, the green thread, the ink-smudged manuscript, the missing pages, the brass key, the green paint, the cigarette butt with its red stain, and Felix Mortimer's partial confession of theft. One note remained: the identity of the killer. Raymond West, beside her, shifted restlessly. "Aunt Jane, you're so calm," he whispered. "Mortimer's admitted to stealing the score, but you're still watching Clara, Havers, and Price. Like hawks, have you got it?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, her eyes never leaving the stage where Sir Rowland Havers raised his baton. Clara Vane stood poised for her aria, and Edwin Price hovered in the wings, his eyes on the audience. "Patience, Raymond," she murmured. "A symphony builds to its climax, and so does truth. Tonight, the music will play its part." The orchestra began, the first notes of Langston's symphony soaring, a testament to his genius. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were on the studio, where the violin string had ended his life. Mortimer's confession had clarified the theft, pages 47 to 50. Taken in a fit of envy, but the murder was a different act, born of a deeper passion. The green thread, silk like Clara's handkerchief, and the cigarette butt with her red lipstick, pointed to her presence. But the green paint on the windowsill and the outward break suggested a hasty act, not a planned one. Havers's pride and Price's greed lingered in her mind. But the string, so intimate, suggested a killer who knew Langston's habits. As Clara's aria began, her voice crystalline yet strained, Miss Marple recalled the cigarette butt in the alley Clara had admitted to smoking outside, lingering after her supposed departure at 10:30. Her maid's testimony placed her out until midnight, and the green paint speck on her shawl matched the studio's window frame. Yet Clara's denial was fierce, her tears convincing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the violin string, held by Langston during his row with Mortimer. A taunt, she mused, turned into a weapon. During a pause in the music, Miss Marple slipped backstage, her movements unnoticed amid the flurry of stagehands. She found Inspector Crane near the wings, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've analysed the shawl. Green paint, matching the studio's frame, and a shard of glass caught in the silk. Veins in deep." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on Clara, whose aria reached a haunting climax. "And the string, Inspector? Any traces?" Crane produced a small evidence bag containing a single silk thread green, identical to the one from the armchair. "Found on the violin string itself," he said. "It's Clara's, no doubt." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place, the final note resolving. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a scorned woman had turned a lover's gift into a weapon. Here, Clara's devotion to Langston's music, her fear of losing the aria, had twisted into rage. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe we have our killer. Let's speak to Miss Vane after her performance." The symphony ended to thunderous applause, Clara's aria a triumph despite the shadow over it. As the audience dispersed, Miss Marple and Crane waited in a small dressing room, where Clara entered, her face flushed with exertion and emotion. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "you're here again. I've done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but unyielding. "Miss Vane, your voice is a gift, but it hides a truth. You lingered outside the studio, smoking, after Mortimer left. You saw him take the pages, didn't you? And when you returned, Victor was angry, holding the violin string, perhaps threatening to give your aria to another. You acted in a moment of fear." Clara's hands clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide. "No, I told you, I left." "The cigarette butt," Miss Marple continued, "with your red lipstick, the green paint on your shawl, from the window you broke to escape, the silk thread on the string from your handkerchief. You strangled him, Clara, to keep your place." In his music, Clara's composure shattered, a sob escaping. He was going to take it away. The ariette was mine, my moment. He said I wasn't good enough, that he'd give it to someone else. I grabbed the string from his hand, and I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. Crane stepped forward, his voice firm. "Clara Vane, you're under arrest." As Clara was led away, her sobs echoing, Miss Marple sat back, her heart heavy. The music had played, the truth revealed. She thought of Langston, his genius silenced, and Clara, whose passion had turned to poison. "Love," she said softly, "is a dangerous note when played out of tune." Raymond, wide-eyed, followed her out of the hall. "Aunt Jane, you did it. But how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled, stepping into the cool night in St. Mary. "Mead, Raymond, a woman once killed for a rose garden she thought was hers. Here it was an aria. The clues a string, the paint, the thread sang the same song. Human nature, dear, is the same everywhere." As they walked through Covent Garden's glowing streets, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the symphony. Now complete with its recovered pages, the music would live on, but its composer was silent, a victim of the discord that envy and love could play. She adjusted her hat, her mind already turning to the quiet of her village, where simpler melodies awaited